Hello, everybody. This week we are talking about the Civil War. So, the key points we're going to talk about this week are the multiple phases of the Civil War. It started out as a war for union and then evolved into a war for emancipation. In the very early stages of the war, Lincoln had said, to paraphrase, that if he could choose union over ending slavery, he would choose union. That position evolved as the war continued. Some questions to consider as we're going through this week. Consider what is more important to people at this stage in 1860, the majority of people. Is it to preserve the Union or to end slavery? So I mentioned Lincoln's quote there. Different factions will have different opinions. But in large part, or the majority of people in the country, the primary goal was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. That would come later throughout the war. Lincoln's question when he was running for office, when running for senator, we talked about this last week, could the nation survive half free and half slave? What brought us to the brink of war? Consider that we talked about the sectionalism of the 1850s, and compromise was no longer possible at this point. Well, it was possible in 1850. By 1860, it was no longer possible. Also, some questions to consider throughout this period, because Lincoln will take extraordinary measures. We kind of touched on earlier in the course the power of the presidency and how it was expanded. Thomas Jefferson, the Louisiana Purchase, and with Andrew Jackson, expansion of the presidency, and Lincoln will further that greatly, expanding the slavery, expanding the authority of the federal government with such actions as suspending habeas corpus. And the draft. Never before had there been a draft in United States history. That wasn't necessary for the War of 1812 or for previous conflicts. This would be the first time ever that there was a draft. So here we are, 1860, on the brink of war. The Southern economy is booming. We talked about the Panic of 1857, how that didn't impact the South as much as the North. By 1860, the U.S. is the #1 cotton producer in the world. All of that cotton pretty much is being produced in the South, and the #3 manufacturer in the world behind Great Britain and France. The South is much wealthier than the North. About 2/3 of the people worth $100,000 or more are in the South. Federal law, even for free blacks, was very restrictive. By this point, there's about 500,000 free blacks, and it's about half and half in the North and the South. You don't normally think about the South having a large free black population, but it did. It was about 250,000 people there. But at this point, the law was greatly tilted against African Americans. Federal law prohibited African Americans from owning a passport, from claiming public land, from working at the post office. And so there was still a great deal of legal racism, social racism, of course, but even legal racism in the North, where slavery had been outlawed for decades by this point. So here we are. 1787, there was a compromise as part of the Constitution. 1820, shouldn't be 21, 1820, the Missouri Compromise. 1850, the 1850 Compromise. Compromise as far as we talked about the northern presidencies of Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, even though they were sympathetic to the South. So we had some compromises in the White House. Throughout our history, we've had these compromises. Also, throughout our history, we'd had threats of secession and threats of civil war. We had that with shortly after the Constitution. We had that in the War of 1812. We had that with the South Carolina nullification. There was claims of civil war starting back in 1850, Kansas-Nebraska territory. But what changed now was the election of this man. So the election of Abraham Lincoln. He was the first openly anti-slavery president. Nobody voted for him in the South. He wasn't even on the ballots in the South, but he still managed to win the presidency. And this is just a real interesting lithograph of Lincoln and how his detractors saw him being led. You can't really read all these little cartoons here, but you can see he's being led to the lunatic asylum. So he's kind of the Republican Party going to the White House. You can see there's African Americans in his procession here. I don't know if this is an Irishman, an immigrant, but these different factions are seen as a lunatic in the White House now. So we see critics of Lincoln. There's some more interesting lithographs or drawings, political cartoons at the beginning of Lincoln's presidency. The one on the left, an abduction of the Yankee goddess of liberty. So the Prince of Darkness, Abraham Lincoln, bears her away to his infernal regions. So obviously, it's an anti-Lincoln cartoon. We don't really think of Lincoln. Well, maybe we do, as being this this lambasted in the press. And then we have this one here, which is more of a probably would have come around 1862 with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is Lincoln's last warning. So last warning to the South, where he's now cutting down the tree of slavery. So this probably would have been around the Emancipation Proclamation. Some really good things to read into these political cartoons at the time. So the Civil War starts. It's key to note it's brought about by the tensions over the expansion of slavery, not necessarily slavery itself. So Lincoln doesn't enter office as an abolitionist president. He enters office as opposing the expansion of slavery. And we've talked about this all semester, how threatening that was to the South, because if slavery did not expand, there was all this unclaimed territory that it would eventually be states. So the writing was on the wall. If none of them are going to be slave states, that very soon free states would outnumber slave states. And also considering the fact that slavery and free states were at the point where they really couldn't coexist in the same country, that the writing was on the wall that slavery would be abolished. So that was unpalatable to the South. So these red states, South Carolina secedes within weeks of Lincoln's election. And then the rest of the states here, by the time Lincoln takes office, maybe shortly after he takes office, all of these states have seceded from the Union. So it's 11 states forming their own country. It's debatable whether it was technically its own country, because it was never recognized by anyone. Lincoln never recognized the Confederate States of America as their own country. No other nation recognized the Confederate States of America, and that was a big fear for the Union, that other states or that other countries, as the war was dragging on, especially Great Britain, was hurting because they weren't getting cotton from the South. So the great fear was other countries would start to recognize the Confederate States of America as a legitimate country, and would really hurt the chances of the Union winning the war. So the Confederate States of America print their own currency. They establish their own post office. They have their own draft, except in the North has a draft. In the South, they exempt one white man for every 20 slaves he owned. So this really furthers the notion the South is already seen as a gentry aristocracy, where a small number of people hold. I think it was like 5% of the people hold 50% of the slaves. So many in the South are already seeing this as a war to defend the rights of the slaveocracy. Now with this exemption, which exempted many of these large slave owners. Not too many people, even slave owners, about 25% of the population own slaves. Very few would have owned 20 slaves or more. So you have this small population being exempt from the draft because of how many slaves they owned. There's always some debate over the if linking slavery to the Civil War. So here's a quote from Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. The foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. So it was pretty undeniable that the war was about slavery mixed in with states' rights to own slaves. So the war begins. I'm not really going to go through the war battle by battle. I'm not a Civil War historian or a military historian. It starts with Fort Sumter. Those are the first shots fired. They're fired by the Confederates upon the Union, there was a Union fort or a federal fort in the South that was being attacked. So the first shots were fired by the South. We kind of talked about this with the Mexican-American War, that in a war for the moral authority, it's critical that the enemy fires first, and then you're just defending yourself. So Lincoln was very adamant that he didn't want to fire the first shots of the Civil War. There's some early defeats. Bull Run. McClellan is the general, and he's kind of dragging his feet. He's known as a great parader, but a procrastinator. So the South gets some early advantage. Some people expect the war is just going to take a couple of weeks. Nobody really thought that the war was going to last 4 years. Now, to kind of show where opinion was, where it started out as a war for Union and not a war to end slavery. John Fremont is a general in Missouri, and he issues a Fremont Emancipation Proclamation that frees all confiscated slaves in Missouri. Lincoln rescinds it. So, why did he do that? He did it because one of the forces he was grappling with was going back to these states here. Some of the states right here. So these border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Well, Missouri, I'm not sure about Kentucky, but there was slave states still in the Union. The Maryland and Missouri, for sure. These were two slave states, border states that stayed loyal to the Union. If Lincoln was too aggressive in trying to end slavery, he would have lost these border states. And so they don't have it on the map here, but you have Maryland over here, and you have Virginia over here. So Virginia is part of the Confederacy. Maryland is part of the Union. Right over here is Washington, D.C. So to the south of D.C. is the Confederate. To the north of D.C. is the Union. If they lose Maryland, now the capital of the United States of America is surrounded by the Confederates. So it was key to not rush on ending slavery. And there's a great clip from one of my all-time favorite movies, which is Lincoln, which I'm going to put. There's a YouTube link on it where Lincoln is speaking with a radical Republican, Thaddeus Stevens, and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. And by radical, I mean that he was an abolitionist Republican and wanted to punish the South confiscate all their wealth, use it to establish African American schools, free slave schools, to give land to free slaves, redistribute the land. So he wanted to harshly punish the South. Uh, Lincoln was more tempered, and it's a really good video. It's I mean, it's a clip from Lincoln. It's about a 3-minute clip, but just the debate between the two, you can kind of hear the things that Lincoln was struggling with and why he couldn't make this a war to end slavery too soon. So the first phase of this, and we saw this in our readings, was a war for union. Like I say here, that Lincoln needed the slave states in the Union, could not denounce slavery too soon. But by 1862, Lincoln's administration. None of we talk about Lincoln and Washington and Jackson. When we talk about individual presidents like that, we really mean their administration and society as a whole. It's not just one person, but there are obviously individual people who are much more critical to American history than others. So we start to see this slow abolishment of slavery. There's confiscation acts in 1861 where slaves could be seized as property. 1862, slavery is abolished in Washington, D.C. So September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln is, or in September 1862, Lincoln wants to publish the Emancipation Proclamation. But he doesn't want to do it as a sign of weakness. He doesn't want it to look like it's a desperate measure to win the war. So he wants to do it after a Union victory. And many of the battles in the Civil War, it isn't always so clear who won, who lost. It's kind of like a similar story where one side might have had the advantage, but never pursued the other side, where Antietam, Gettysburg, these could have been decisive battles, and there's plenty of others. But the victor didn't pursue the enemy and didn't kind of close out the war. So Antietam was one of those, but it's generally regarded that the North was the victor. So Antietam, the bloodiest battle, the bloodiest single day, it might be to this day still in American history, in American military history, is won by the North on September 17th, 1862. 5 days later, Lincoln publishes the Emancipation Proclamation. But there's questionable legality over this. It's a war measure, so this isn't a constitutional amendment. It doesn't end slavery. More importantly, as far as the Emancipation Proclamation, we rightfully hold this up as one of our the most important documents in American history. But who was really freed by the Emancipation Proclamation? So I think I paraphrased the text here a little bit to have it fit on a slide, but on January 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state that people whereof shall be in rebellion against the U.S. shall be thenceforth and forever free. So this is saying any of the slaves in the Confederate States of America are free. This doesn't free any slaves in the border states that are still part of the Union. Doesn't free one slave in Missouri. Doesn't free one slave in Maryland. And the Confederate States of America would contend that Lincoln had no authority over the slaves in the Confederate States of America. So there wasn't any slaves that were freed, that were set free, or that were granted their freedom after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's highly symbolic, but in actuality, nobody was set free on January 1st, 1863. But as Union forces won victories in the South, these slaves were free. So people were free, but on January 1st, nobody willingly set their slaves free due to the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a little bit of verbal gymnastics in there that's worth noting. So what's widely seen as the pivotal battle between to shift from the South winning the war to the North winning the war is Gettysburg. And I highly recommend, if you haven't been to Gettysburg, it's about maybe a 3-hour drive, but it's fantastic. The battlefield, the museums there, it's just a real cool city. Uh, so Gettysburg is won July 4th, 1863, the same day Vicksburg is won in Mississippi. So it's a highly significant day. This is July 4th. Uh, Meanwhile, Lincoln has started a draft, and part of the draft is, and we talked about how the South was kind of framing their draft as as a poor man's war to fight for the rich by exempting slaveholders. In the North, there's something similar too, a similar tactic where people can pay $300 to hire someone else to fight in their place. So it's a mandatory draft. Poor people, $300, that's like a year's wages in 1863. Um, Interestingly, Grover Cleveland, who would later become president, uh, and he's the only Democratic president from Abraham Lincoln to Woodrow Wilson. So within a 50-year span, uh, had paid someone, a Polish immigrant, $300 to replace him. So he's the only president that didn't either was a president during the Civil War or served in the Civil War, all the way up to William McKinley when he got shot in 1901. Anyway, right. So with this draft, people in New York City start to riot. And I think I mentioned last week, the Gangs of New York with the Uncle Tom's Cabin play. The Gangs of New York, the pivotal scene takes place during these draft riots. Uh, and so uh, rioters indiscriminately kill African Americans, and there's gruesome murders and hangings. They burn down an African American children's orphanage, so they're just going wild, attacking African Americans, anyone they see. Veterans or soldiers from Gettysburg, July 4th, are quickly moved to New York. A week later, they're battling the draft rioters, and they kill 100 rioters. Uh, so uh, this has turned into, maybe going back here, I can't remember if I stressed this point, but the war for union is now becoming a war for emancipation with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the shift that we see here. With the draft riots and the attacks upon African Americans, that is widely in response to the American Proclamation or the Emancipation Proclamation, because now they see it as they're being sent into war to defend African Americans and to end slavery, not so much just to end the Union. Gettysburg Address, I won't do it. There's African Americans in the Union Army. There's kind of a reluctance at first for African Americans to be allowed in the Army. Frederick Douglass lobbies hard for this, directly with Abraham Lincoln. When they do join the Army, they're given less pay. So I was just watching a scene from Glory. Excellent movie if you haven't seen Glory. It's from 1989, about the first, or one of the most prominent African American regiments, which is the Massachusetts 54th. Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, Matthew Broderick. So it's an excellent cast. And there's a great scene in it where they're being told that they get, instead of $13 a month, they're only getting $10 a month. So at first they're getting less pay. But the Army is integrated. And the African American soldiers help further turn the tide towards a union. And by spring of 1865, we have 200,000 in the Army. 1864 election. The war has been going on throughout Lincoln's presidency. He hasn't won the war yet. His former general, who's by this point been replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, George McClellan, runs against Abraham Lincoln. He's a war hero or a loved military hero. Lincoln is almost convinced that he's going to lose, but he ends up winning handily. The 221 or 221 to 21 electoral votes. Uh, Women in the Civil War. Uh, because of necessity, and we saw this with Manifest Destiny, and we'll see this after the war, because of so many men that had died during the war, uh, it expands the role of women. Women in the work phase, women in the workforce. This is both in the North and the South. Here we have a picture of women from the Confederacy with a Confederate flag behind them. Nurses. These are nurses here. Women as nurses, as clerks in factories and farming. Clara Barton famously started the Red Cross. She's one of many examples. Here's a lithograph here of all the different ways that women served in the war as spiritual advisors, as nurses, seamstress, etc. So it's great opportunity opening up for women because of the Civil War. So the end of the war. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. Again, I'm not the Civil War. We can spend the whole semester talking about the Civil War and going through battle for battle. I've kind of really highlighted very high level some of the key battles, but it's definitely not the area of focus here. But I do encourage you to learn more about the Civil War. So Lee surrenders April 9th. The numbers for how many dead range from about 600,000 to 750,000. It's a huge number compared to the population. 260,000 Confederate dead, 360,000 Union dead. Those numbers could be much higher too. I've seen higher estimates. Of the 360,000 Union dead, 250,000 are from diseases or infection. So just like previous wars, it's more the diseases that ravaged the military. We saw that with Valley Forge in the Revolutionary War. The more people died there from disease than really nobody died for the military conflict in Valley Forge. Another key thing about the war is that it's expensive. The annual budget was $63 million in 1860. It balloons like 13 times. So it's $865 million by 1865. This is where we're going to leave it for now. 5 days after this, Abraham Lincoln is shot completely, and he dies. April 15th completely reshapes the future of Reconstruction. The war actually goes on a little bit past this due to fighting in the West, the capture of Jefferson Davis in May. But for all intents and purposes, the war ends at Appomattox, and we begin the Reconstruction phase. So we're going to talk more about that next week, which is our last week of study. Some recommendations to learn more about the Civil War and learn more about this period. I'm a big fan of these wars or of these books that just kind of talk about 1 year. And there's 1861, which is the beginning of the Civil War. 1863, this is the focus towards emancipation. This really focuses on that shift of a war for union and a war for emancipation to end slavery. And then April 1865, I just touched on that briefly, probably one of the most significant months in American history. We have the end of the Civil War, the murder of Abraham Lincoln, the month-long funeral that takes place, or 20 days between Abraham Lincoln's assassination and when he's finally buried in Springfield, Missouri. So an excellent book, 3 great books to really understand and kind of zero in on certain years of the Civil War, certain periods of the Civil War. Also, movies to learn more. Lincoln, you've heard me talk about it. I will continue to talk about it probably through the rest of the class. It's a fantastic movie. It focuses more on the Reconstruction phase because it's focusing more on the on the passing of the 13th Amendment. So it really kind of zeroes in on that, and we're going to talk more about that in the Reconstruction phase, but it's just an excellent movie, and to understand what Lincoln was grappling with and what the Union was grappling with, highly recommended. The Civil War documentary by Ken Burns. This came out in '91. This really had a huge or caused a huge resurgence in interest in the Civil War. This is probably came out only about 15 years after Vietnam. The Civil War wasn't such a popular subject anymore, so he really brought it back to the American consciousness. And Glory. I talked about this before too. Fantastic movie. Also to go visit, we have some of the most significant Civil War battlefields within a couple hours drive from here. So Gettysburg, Antietam, Harper's Ferry. You can go see, kind of going back a week, where John Brown tried to seize the armory. So a lot of Civil War history, all to the south of us, but definitely worth a visit. With that, we are going to leave it, and I am looking forward to your discussion.